G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and of course sovereignty was never ceded. We do like to do these webinars at least weekly, but days and times do vary. Tonight we're coming to you at 5 p.m. Normally we're in the morning, so thanks for joining us again. But just a reminder for all our upcoming webinars and the details for those, you can find those at australiainstitute.org.au. Coming up next week, we've got our regular chat with Catherine Murphy of The Guardian and Pete Lewis from Essential Media. That's Pole Position next Tuesday. And then the week after that, a fortnight from now, we'll be talking to the former European Commissioner for Trade, Cecilia Malmström, and former European Foreign Correspondent for the ABC, Michael Brissenden, about a green recovery versus a gas-fired recovery. So that should be a really good one. Just a few tips before we begin this evening to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our guest and upvote questions from other people and make comments on their questions as well. Please keep things both civil and on topic in the chat, or we will boot you out. And finally, this is a live event and it's being recorded. And thanks again for joining us. I'm really excited about today's guest. Chanel Contos shot to prominence in mid-February last year, not that long ago, when a poll she conducted on social media asking whether any of her friends who attended Sydney private schools at the time had been raped or sexually assaulted. And that poll went viral. It was the beginning of a campaign to ensure that all Australian students receive comprehensive sexual education, and much earlier. Chanel has begun to drive change across the Australian states in the forms of reforming the education when it comes to sexuality, sex, and consent. She's also driving changes to legislation and resource reallocation, engaging and collaborating with school principals, with police, with parliamentary officials in several states, and she's been acting as a key contributor to the launch of New South Wales Police Operation Vest, which is a sexual assault reporting system. Chanel is now London-based. She's a sexual assault activist, tutor, and a postgraduate student currently undertaking a master's. So it's not as if she doesn't have a lot on already. And she's doing that at the University College of London, which is where she's joining us from today. Thanks, Chanel. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Hi, Ebony. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah. So obviously it's been a massive year. I did just want to kind of ask you to take us back to that original poll that you posted, that moment in time, kind of why you posted it and what that immediate kind of and viral reaction was to it.
Yeah, so I posted the poll in February this year, except actually last year in around May was when the idea started bubbling in my head. And this was because I was with friends who, we were friends when we were younger in the same social circle, went to parties together, but went to different independent schools around Sydney. And basically at the sleepover, we started having deep conversations, and as people do when they're spending lots of time together. And in that conversation, two things happened. One, we all opened up about our sexual assault experiences that happened while we were in high school. And two, I found out in that moment that the same boy who sexually assaulted me when I was 13 sexually assaulted another one of my mutual friends when she was 14. And this was insanely distressing to me because I was thinking, if he knew what consent was, then it wouldn't have happened to me in the first place. Or if I knew what consent was, I would have reported it and it wouldn't have happened to her. Anyway, so that's when I collected my first few testimonies, just about 10 or so from the people I was with, and by texting close friends that I knew had experienced sexual assault in high school. And then I kind of had it as a COVID project and then ended up getting into my master's at UCL and kind of sidelined it, had it at the back of my mind, but wasn't as engaged with it. And then in February this year, one of my close school friends who had also been sexually assaulted when we were young, and I both saw and stopped that rape, was really distressed, we were having like a moment, we're sitting on the floor of my room, and lockdown was very dramatic, crying. And it was just this frustration of, this is us 10 years later still experiencing trauma symptoms, and the boys probably completely unaware they ever did this to us because they were never adequately taught what consent was. Which initially the plan was to actually post the names of the boys, which thank God we did not do. We were going to do that in a bit of a like thing of anger. And instead, my very rational flatmate advised that we made the poll a bit more broad and anonymous. And then I remember that I had all these testimonies banked up from the year before, and so I posted the Instagram poll, and the response was pretty instant and crazy.
Yeah, and it kind of went viral and drew a lot of attention to it, and you ended up doing quite a bit of media. What was that like at the time to kind of do this little thing over here and then it just explodes in a different way?
Oh my God, it was so intense. I literally had no idea that would ever happen. I've also never spoken to media at all before in my life, and then suddenly it was just like back-to-back interviews. I literally did not sleep for days. In hindsight, it was pretty crazy. I remember like being in bed 5 minutes before a Sky News interview and someone being like, get up, and me being like, no, I'm not doing it. I'm too tired. It just went crazy, but I just wanted to get the message out there as much as I could to as many people as I could. I wanted it to be in conversation. I feel like it kept the momentum going because I feel people felt empowered that people were actually listening. It wasn't just going to Instagram and then going away after 24 hours. It was getting media attention, and people who needed to be watching that were watching it. People like politicians, parents, teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the key things from all those testimonies was obviously just how many young women it was happening to, the similarity of those stories. Sometimes it was, from strangers that they'd only met at a party, but other times people within a friendship group. Looking at all those testimonies and reading them must have been quite traumatic for you as well. But if you can just take us back, what stuck out to you when you were just looking at that absolute flood of testimonies of what had happened to young women?
So the first, I'd say, week or so was when the vast majority of testimonies came in, and it was kind of just constant. If I wasn't doing media, I was reading them and posting them. And just the thing that got me was it's just the exact same. If it's someone messaging, if someone's submitting a testimony from Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia, we had such similar experiences. It's the same stories over and over again. You can pick out like 4 or 5 events that seem to just be the norm amongst early teen experiences. What stuck out to me was the fact that collectively, as like a country, as thousands of girls, this happened to us, and we were just so unequipped with the tools to be able to articulate. But it was just the fact that it was so similar across Australia. And also I got some testimonies from the UK.
Yeah, wow. So obviously a lot of those testimonies were quite shocking, and they did prompt a quick response from several schools. And then you've gone into kind of your campaign to push for earlier education about consent in schools. What's the problem there? How big is that gap between when girls and I guess some young men as well are experiencing these sexual assaults and when they're learning about consent within the curriculum?
So in Australia, currently consent education is not mandatory as a whole. If your school does choose to teach consent, it comes in when you're around 16 years old, which is also the legal age of consent in Australia. Oh, in New South Wales, it varies slightly between different states and territories. But basically, by the time, if you're speaking to a room of year 10 to 12 students in Australia, 50% of them are already sexually active, and they're hearing about consent for the first time at that age, which is so problematic because it's leaving our children so insanely unsafe. And even if we do bring that down a few years, it still needs to be brought down lower, because we need to teach consent in an explicitly sexual way from a young age before students are having sex, because we leave that 13 to 16 age gap is where students are insanely vulnerable to grooming, to, you know, boys a few years older than them, to not understanding how consent works in different situations, not knowing that you have to consent every single time with a boyfriend or a sexual partner. And then also concepts of consent in terms of just how to interact human to human, sex aside, just boundaries and respect. You know, we need that to be brought in from primary school age, so that by the time we add the layer of sexual consent, it just makes sense straight away to these students.
Yeah, and the testimony is obviously pretty heavily focused on the experiences of young women, but what has been the reaction from young men that you've experienced or heard about?
So it's been a really interesting mix of reactions from young men. It's been overall really positive, is what I would say. I've had quite a lot of people message me or submit testimonies, especially young men who are now adults, you know, that kind of early 20s range, who are very openly reflective about their experiences in high school and the culture that they now see they were bystanders to. Or, you know, even again, just saying, like, I was uncomfortable with that, but I didn't even know how to explain that I was uncomfortable with that or why until I was older, and kind of got the opportunity to make new friends and expand horizons. But when you're in school, you're kind of in this just echo chamber, and it's very dictated by a small group of people, kind of set the scene in the culture. So there's been lots of reflection. There's been very high engagement from men, but there's also been a lot of young boys and men who have switched off. You know, there's comments on my post always that are quite misogynistic. There's I know of examples of girls who have approached their rapist from high school and basically been like, you know, I'm not trying to take you to jail here, but I want an apology. And there's just been full denial, which is quite disappointing to hear. But you can also understand the way that our like justice system is currently set up, why they feel that needs to be the case. So there's been a mixed reaction, but I think overall quite positive. And there's also been lots of boys and young men who have submitted testimonies of sexual assault themselves, and I think are also experiencing a breath of relief with this conversation being in public discourse, because it does reduce the taboo for them in a sense as well.
Yeah. I want to kind of go back to a point that you've made there. So the Australia Institute, a couple of years back, we did a poll around street harassment and experience of that. And primarily obviously affects women, but primarily young women. And we found that overall the perpetrators were generally men targeting younger women, while young women were alone and the perpetrator was also alone. So it was kind of an iceberg essentially, where it was being experienced by a lot of women, but often completely, you know, while the perpetrator and the victim were alone. And so I think the results that we had shocked a lot of men who might not have witnessed it, and so obviously didn't think it was happening that often. But obviously women all have a story like that to relate. Do you think this has been like a similar phenomenon, and that part of the reason why perhaps young women weren't coming forward about these stories was often the complications of that it's not a stranger in some cases, that it is people they go to school with, people in their friendship group and things like that?
100%. I think it is. I get so many messages from boys being like, especially I'm not sure how many people follow me on Instagram or anything, but I posted a story a few days ago saying, what does your rapist do now? And posted the responses. And, you know, the majority, my point was that these people who rape people in their teen years are usually funneled directly into positions of power for reasons I could talk about for hours. So I won't go into that. But so many men message me saying, I'm shocked by this. I can't believe this. I never thought this would happen. And, you know, that whole there's no incentive to lie when you're doing an anonymous survey or anything like that. And I think that's the thing, you know, not every single man has seen this type of violence be perpetrated or has done it themselves, but almost every single person who has ever experienced life as a woman has felt what it's like to be sexualized, sexually harassed, sexually assaulted. And something that I want to pick up on that you said as well is when you said it's usually young women. It really disturbs me going into schools speaking to children, literal children, 15, 16, 14-year-old girls, and talking about how sexual harassment is part of their every single day life, by adult men, by grown men, by men who can drive cars, who can honk at them when they walk past. And it seems to just be like the way our society views girls, specifically young ones, specifically schoolgirls, is so problematic.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about how young it starts. I think of the women that we surveyed, at least half said it had happened kind of before they were 18, if not more than that. So like it was huge numbers. So it's definitely amongst street harassment anyway. It was really obvious that it was definitely targeted at young women. I did want to move now more towards, I guess, the education and the other engagement that you're having with police and others. You talked about the fact that some of the young perpetrators, or some young men, even if they're not perpetrators, kind of resisting this idea about how widespread this problem is and how many young men engage in this type of behavior, and that some of those men don't want to admit to what they've done for the obvious justice implications that they might face criminal charges, for example. A couple of years back, I spoke to Tarana Burke, who was the founder of the Me Too movement, and she was accepting the 2019 Sydney Peace Prize. And she wrote and talked a lot about the fact that it's important for accountability to be led by survivors, and that, because I might just read you a quote actually. She said, "We also need to have more intentional public dialogue about accountability, and not just the kind that focuses on crime and punishment, but on harm and harm reduction. And narrowing our focus to investigations, firings, and prison can hinder that conversation and the reality that accountability and justice look different for different people. That sexual violence happens on a spectrum, so accountability also has to happen on a spectrum. And that means that various ways of being accountable are necessary, and that it's survivors that have to be the ones leading that." So it really struck me, I guess, in terms of that harm reduction approach that Tarana Burke was talking about, that you're pushing kind of education and much earlier consent education within the school system, but also I might ask you in a minute to talk a little bit about Operation Vest, but can you just tell me first about that education side of things and the work that you're doing in that space with schools, and how receptive they've been to making those kinds of changes that you're seeking?
Yeah, so in terms of the education space, it's kind of been like a bit of a stepping stone. It started with my initial target audience, which was my old school, which is an independent all-girls school in Sydney, and kind of like the neighbouring single-sex schools around that area. And then it just kind of kept going up and up and up to the point where I'm now speaking with ACARA, which is the Australian Curriculum and Reporting Authority, and the Minister of Education for Australia, Alan Tudge. But in terms of independent schools, there's been some schools that have really led in this space. We've had Sydney Boys, which, they had a few testimonies on my site, announce that they will be investing $25,000 in reforming consent education. I know that my old school has created a working group of about 8 or so people that are involved in reforming not just consent education, but the culture around consent, dealing with education from not just the perspective of children, but teachers and parents, personal bias. And I know that there's been schools, like, for example, a religious school in Sydney, a very independent, like kind of elite religious school in Sydney, has really led the way in showing how consent education and religious ethos can be taught hand in hand and like not mutually exclusively. But there still is pushback from some schools. Like one of the schools that was the one of the most named schools on my site appeared, I think, around 250 times the headmaster has stopped replying to emails. And, there's, it's not everyone's entirely keen to, fully face this, but I think when you're dealing with peer-on-peer child sexual assault, it's quite hard to deny that there is a problem, especially when you have that evidence bank. And overall, the reception has been really productive. And I mean, the ask is so simple. It's earlier and it's more holistic consent education. And when I say more holistic, I mean talking about power imbalances, talking about, explicitly detailing how this plays out in different sexual situations with strangers or with long-term partners, things like that.
Yeah. I was going to ask next about the work with the police and Operation Vest in particular. Can you just tell us, for people who don't know, what that operation is about and your engagement with it?
Yeah, so New South Wales Police has an anonymous reporting option, which basically means you are able to submit your story of, not story, like submit your, what's it called, like a experience, yeah, in a like criminal manner with like detail about, where you were, what the perpetrator was wearing, how well you know them, if you know their address, things like that. And the purpose of it was, if you've experienced a sexual assault and you're not then ready to go and report to police, because we all know how triggering of a process that could be and how difficult that is, especially for young girls, to do, is you do it from the comfort of your home in your laptop and you type it all up while it's in your head. And then in the future, if you ever want to call back on that experience, there's a database there. So it already exists and you've given the information when it was fresh in your head. However, I worked with Stacey Maloney, who at the time was head of sex crime squad in New South Wales. And we basically kind of rebranded the same system, labeled it Operation Vest, and did two things with it. One, we advertised it heavily so people were aware that it was an option because it was something that people didn't know about. And two, we reframed in a way to say, report your historical case. We will look for repeat offenders. And then if anyone ever comes in the future to officially and formally report a sexual assault, your testimony is there to even back up in terms of the victim blaming, from the police perspective. Sorry, there's someone cleaning my street. I hope you can't hear that.
That's all right.
From even like, the police person's perspective in terms of looking back at this and being like, oh, this person has done this 3 times before, and, really encouraging that person in front of them to take the case seriously. You can choose to leave your number so that you can be called back up, so the victims can be put in touch if that's what they both want, and things like that. And it's basically a way of being like, accountability is being held. We don't have any interest in taking these 6,500 teenage boys to jail that did these things 10 years ago, but from now on, what you do in the future matters. So if you believe that there may be an Operation Vest report about you, be extremely cautious of your actions. And it kind of just normalizes the reporting process, gets someone that one step closer to be able to feel empowered to make a formal report.
Yeah.
But what you're saying about kind of like options of accountability, I 100% agree with that. We need more options for especially youth survivors to be able to hold accountability in a way that is not traumatic for them.
Yeah. And as you said, not everyone has great experiences with the justice system, so it is important to have that range of options. But what you've just said there really struck me as being incredibly useful. I know there was a big review of, there was in the United States a bunch of rape kits that had never been tested, tens and thousands of them, and they started submitting them all and processing them all. And it turned out that they identified multiple serial perpetrators, serial rapists, just from processing those kits. So it can be a behaviour that obviously with many repeat offenders in there. So really important work to be doing. And what has that been like in terms of working with New South Wales Police? How open have they been to, feedback from you and other survivors and organisations who advocate on behalf of sexual assault victims?
They've been really great, especially Stacey Maloney, who has since been promoted, which is slightly unfortunate because I loved her in that role, but it's also great because she's going to do amazing things wherever she goes. But just so open to engaging with youth, so victim focused. Stacey, like her mindset is rape is a preventable crime. And, if the police had thought that way for the last 50 years, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. But it's always been very like victim blaming in nature, the kind of questions that you tend to get asked when you do make reports and things like that. So yeah, it's been a really pleasant experience. And in the month that Operation Best launched, there was a 61% unprecedented increase in sexual assault reports in New South Wales.
Wow. Yeah, that's an amazing result. I did just want to ask you, I guess, I know you're in London, but I'm here in the Canberra bubble, and I guess it's been just a huge year and a real moment that we find ourselves in. We had the Brittany Higgins coming forward with her rape allegations in Parliament that really created quite a storm, and now I believe there's charges being laid in her case. But we've also seen kind of some amazing reporting led by women members of the press gallery of those allegations, but also, any number of other stories that we could point to this year, and seems like a real reckoning that Australia is having, and a real moment where so many women are coming forward, being supported by other women and other survivors in a way that just can't be ignored. At the beginning of the year, obviously, Grace Tame won Australian of the Year. As an activist who is working for change, do you feel like there's still a lot of momentum as a result of all of that happening this year, and it still feels like there's a lot of capacity for change?
I do. I think the momentum is still going, and that's based off, things like the fact that Brittany Higgins' case is coming up. Like, we know that that's going to explode in the media. That's going to be a monumental moment that could either be really powerful and empowering for survivors, or it could be very disheartening and anger everyone all over again. In terms of engagement with the type of like questions I'm posing on social media about rape culture and rapists and things like that, like, people aren't they're not bored of the conversation because they've wanted this conversation for so long. And every couple of weeks there's someone around Australia speaking up in the news, and it's just it's amazing. But we need to get to a point where we start realizing that someone, like, it needs to not be newsworthy to speak up about a sexual assault, because it happens daily and it just needs to be normal. It's not an anomaly for it to happen, it's an anomaly for it to be reported. And once we start understanding that as a whole, it will make it so much easier for people to come forward to their friends, to their families, confronting perpetrators, holding accountability for your friends who may be perpetrators, things like that. But yeah, to answer your question in short, I don't think the momentum is going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, we'll get to questions from the audience soon. So we've got about 520 people on the line with us. So we'll get to those very shortly. But I guess where to from here for you and the activism that you're doing at the moment?
So in terms of the activism I'm doing at the moment, I would say my goals are, and teachers' consents goals in essence, is to mandate consent in the Australian curriculum, which means that all schools in Australia need to teach this content, because even if you have it in state curriculum, it's not mandated in independent schools, and the independent sector in Australia is massive. Two, we need reform to initial teacher education. We need to train our teachers to be transformative actors in promoting a healthy culture. It's one thing to have in a curriculum, it's a whole other thing about how it's taught. And that's not specific to the teachers who are teaching sexuality education and consent. It needs to be something that, teachers on playground duty know how to address when they hear sexist comments or, objectifying remarks. And then what I think is almost most important is just a national conversation. We need to change perspectives. We need parents, teachers, government officials, educators, and children to reflect on what they think is normal, what the result of that has been, which is widespread sexual violence, mainly perpetrated on girls and women, to see what can be done differently and just be open to reflection and change, so that we create a society where, one, it's easy to come forward and gain support if something does happen to you, and two, it just doesn't happen to you because people know it's wrong, and the culture doesn't make it so it pervades without accountability.
Yeah.
And in a personal sense, I just want to finish my master's and try to come home.
20,000 words, I think you were saying before we started. It's a lot. So good luck with that, certainly. And knowing that you've got that deadline barreling towards you, we're even more grateful that you could join us today all the way from London. So thank you. I'll go now to questions from the audience. The first one's more of a comment than a question. I've got a big hi here from your mum and dad, which has got so many likes that it's risen to the top here. So thank you for tuning in, Mr. and Mrs. Contos. We appreciate it. And what an amazing daughter that you've raised. And what a great job she's doing here today. The next question is from Alan Wu. He says, so many female friends have spoken out about their experience of sexual assault, which has me thinking that statistically, I must know some male perpetrators. What should the approach be when we think of one of our friends as being the perpetrator who has assaulted someone?
Yeah, so Alan, you're completely correct in saying that statistically is the case. And I mean, from a personal perspective, one of the hardest things in this campaign for me has been finding out which of my male friends have been perpetrators of sexual assault in their teen years. Obviously, each individual person is going to handle that situation differently. It depends on the specific sexual assault, sexual harassment, rape case, and your relationship with that person. But like, from a personal perspective, my campaign is all about future change, and being able to reflect, take accountability for your own actions and do better in future. And, if someone is now 30 and when they were 15 years old did something that they look back on and really heavily regret and can say they regret, I think something as simple as a conversation could be insanely powerful, making sure that, that they see why and how that was wrong, and that they have felt empathy and guilt for that action. Because as I said, it's not my intention to send 6,500 young boys that did this years ago to jail today. But yeah, I think everyone needs to take with them the heavy message in their day-to-day life that someone who's been sexually assaulted and someone who's sexually assaulted someone, and that means you need to act accordingly in a way that, one, means that you're always creating a safe space for people to feel like they can trust in you, and two, that you're making sure that you're doing things to stop rape culture being perpetuated through everyday objectifying comments, victim blaming, rape jokes, street harassment, all of these things, because those microaggressions is what makes the culture go so unnoticed. And yeah, just remember that someone doesn't need to be sadistic to rape someone. They literally just need to be entitled to someone's body, and not have an understanding or a respect for consent. So yeah, it is obviously different in every individual case, but I think the most important thing you can do is remember that is the reality.
Yeah, and important to remember because, as you said, so many people kind of think of rape as being a stranger in in a dark alley, and that's just so often not the case. So often it is someone that the victim knows. The next question here is from Melina Smith. She's got a bit of an international question here. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has resigned after a sexual harassment report and numerous women going public with their stories. Do we need more men resigning like this here in Australia to have a cultural change in elite circles?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So as I said before, that thing I could talk about for hours that I said I wouldn't go into, I will go into it briefly now. So essentially what my dissertation is on is about how elite schooling institutions uphold structures of power. This is in terms of race, class, and I'm kind of like filling the gap in literature with a look at gender. And what happens is we have these elite institutions that foster a rape culture. They foster, a massive boys club, toxic masculinity, and an environment where boys are socialized only with each other, which makes their interactions with girls on a Saturday night when alcohol is involved really problematic. What you have there is those elite private school boys grow up and they just go straight into positions of power in parliament, in charities, in banks, in all of these things. And I mean, if everyone who's ever sexually harassed someone retired right now, I think our whole economy would collapse. And I say that with the heaviest heart. So again, it needs to be about like accountability and reflection. And there's a trade-off, because no, someone who did that to someone should not be in a position of power. But the reality is so many who have done that are in positions of power. And as I said, our society, like they're currently the people churning our society through. So what we need accountability to be able to be held on understanding that there is a spectrum of sexual violence, and for some people, yes, they should never see the light of day again. For some people, they should never be in a position of power. And for other people, we need to change the narrative so that it's normal to apologize, it's normal to hold accountability, and it's normal to be a role model for younger boys and men and people who have similar claims against them, to tell them that, because being a rapist you very rarely get held accountable in your life for it. And again, I say that with a very heavy heart. So we just need to change the narrative about either also someone who's in an active position of power, like that specific New York case where he is actively sexually harassing his employees. Obviously, absolutely no, got to go, please resign, yes. But I'm talking about people who have done things historically in their youth, is kind of where my conversation is usually focused.
And I'll also point, I guess, people towards the Australian Human Rights Commission. They've done a lot of work around sexual harassment in the workplace, which is still rife. But again, going back to what Chanel's been talking about and what we've been talking about with survivor-led justice and accountability, for a lot of women in the workplace, they just want it to stop. That's the outcome that they're looking for example. So there's a range of outcomes there that people are looking for. But again, the Australian Human Rights Commission, they've done huge reports into that, a lot of recommendations, including up at Parliament House. The next question is from Louise Court. She says, "Hi Chanel, I'm a strong advocate for early consent education in schools and something I feel very passionate about. In your opinion, what's the best thing she can do to help create change?"
So I believe that the best thing individuals can do is kind of go to schools in their local area and their old schools, and not just advocate for consent education in terms of something that's going to be taught to students for 1 hour a year through their lives, but instead changing kind of the culture and like encouraging schools to conduct parent surveys and encouraging schools to hold seminars and get people in to talk to teachers, principals, parents themselves. So yeah, I feel like as an individual, there is so much you can do, and doing it on a local level is usually really, really effective, because you kind of get noticed and that people are willing to engage with you, and it means that you can kind of stay quite intertwined with the whole situation. And you can also support Teachers Consent, follow us on Instagram, and kind of follow all our calls to actions when we're trying to do large things.
Excellent. That's Teach Us Consent. So you can probably find them if you Google them, I'm guessing, Chanel. The next question is from Margaret Tipper. She says, there may need to be some trauma counselling to deal with teachers that are going to introduce the subjects, as they may have been assaulted when they were younger. And that also makes me think about you and the people who work in this space as well. As I said, it might be, well, I'm sure it is very traumatic to be reading these testimonies all the time and just dealing with other people's trauma vicariously. How important is trauma counselling going to be for educators who are doing this kind of thing? And how important is it for activists who are working in this space?
It's insanely important. I think about this a lot. I think about the fact that, if we do get consent in the Australian curriculum, and it is something that, I think it's called different things in different states, but that PDHP, PE type of teacher delivers, we're going to have two things there. We're going to have a lot of survivors who have to then talk about consent and sexual assault to students as survivors themselves. We're going to have perpetrators who have to sit there and deliver consent education to students themselves. And this kind of like trauma counseling, I don't know if it's, even though ideally, everyone should have access to it from a practical sense, I don't know how sustainable that is for all teachers, where the education system is already so push for resources itself. But this is why it's so important to have this sort of information in initial teacher education, which means when we're training teachers, we equip them with the skills to how to deal with traumatic experiences, how to deal with the situation where a child comes to you and tells you that their home life is not safe, how to make sure that in that moment you're making it a comfortable experience for them, how to make sure in that moment that you're keeping a level of empathy, but also protecting your own emotions at the same time, because as a teacher, this is something that's going to happen to you multiple times throughout your career. So it is insanely important. And I think that, again, we need to be taught through generations, through our parents, how to make sure that when people do come to us with these sort of situations, we can help in a way that centers the experience around the victim, but also protects your own mental health. And that's kind of a whole other can of worms that's going to be hard to do, but is necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which that brings me to, you just kind of mentioned the role of parents there. I've got a couple of questions in here about kind of challenging this idea that consent coming through, education coming through schools, should it not be, and kind of saying it shouldn't be primarily the school's responsibility? Shouldn't it be driven at home, in family, and in society? And I guess, could you comment or respond to that? There's a couple of questions in here that kind of make that same point.
Yeah, so I mean, ideally, consent education comes through all layers of our society, all the way from the media, parents, peers, education system. My master's is in gender and education, and how that creates development. And I just personally see education as the largest catalyst for creating societal change, which is why I'm so passionate and advocate for it so passionately. However, the other main thing about education is it can be standardized. We can make sure that every Australian child has consent education. You can't make sure that every parent delivers consent education to their child. You can't check how that is done. You can't make sure that will be done in a safe way. You can't make sure that will be done in a way that is truthful, because if you are a parent in Australia right now and you went through the Australian education system, you didn't receive adequate consent education. So you would have to take it upon yourself to learn those things yourself. And I see it as well as a thing that it's ideally it would come from both parents and schools, but I think that it does need to be in our schools, because it needs to be something that not only every student knows, but that every student knows that every other student knows, so that we can hold each other accountable.
The next question is from Melina Smith. She says, do we need more female representation in our parliaments so women can be involved in more policy decisions that affect younger Australians?
100%. I mean, 100%. Our policies, our structural conditions of our whole society are skewed to benefit men and make it difficult for victims of men perpetrated violence. And yeah, having that from a top level would filter down in policy, in culture, in everything. And it's absolutely fundamental to have female voices in that room who make up an equal part to point out when a policy is going to be counterproductive, or point out when an issue needs to be at the forefront of topics.
And if anyone doubts the necessity of having equal female representation, I'd recommend people check out on iView the Ms. Represented series on ABC, which has focused a lot on the experiences of Australia's first female politicians, and including the experiences of a lot of current ones, and how appalling things still are on a number of fronts, but also the change that women have created through Parliament. Definitely a great one to check out. The next question that I have, where is it? I've lost it now. It's from John Neve, who says, how important is a gender diverse judiciary and better trained and gender diverse police force in terms of giving victims more confidence in coming forwards?
Again, I think having females in positions of power changes the whole perspective about kind of policies and culture and the situation. So yeah, it is a very, very important part. But I mean, you can still experience extreme misogyny perpetrated by a woman or a female, and that's not going to fix all of our issues. There still needs to be a cultural change. And when I'm talking about cultural change, I'm not just talking about the men in our society. I'm also talking about everyone. I'm talking about people who've been socialized as women as well. There's lots of learning we have to do as a society, but more importantly, and almost harder, is the unlearning we have to do as a society. And yeah, understanding kind of power structures as a whole will help that. But it's a good start, but it's not going to be the full issues solved.
Mm. The next question is from Indira Rosenthal. She says, what are the main obstacles to having consent taught in all schools in Australia, and what are the roadblocks?
The main obstacles is kind of society's perception of what is socially acceptable to speak to a child about, including sexual consent. There is also conversations, I've been posed by members of parliament that instead we should teach abstinence, because they say that it's just,
that always works.
yeah, we've seen that work hundreds of times over. But yeah, they say it's just as radical as the idea of what I'm posing, and they believe it will have the same effect. But to me, that is just it just screams that person doesn't know what consent is, because you can rape your wife, you can rape your husband, you can teach consent and abstinence in conjunction if a school wishes to, because consent, sexual assault is not a choice and abstinence is. And yeah, it tends to be the fact that essentially our society doesn't like speaking to children about sex and loves to forget the idea that children are engaging with sexual content on the internet from the age of 11 on average in Australia, and the fact that they speak to their friends about it, they see it in movies, they know what sex is, and all we're doing is creating an unhealthy environment where there's not an open conversation in the community about it. But I feel like that tends to be the biggest roadblock, really, the fact that people think the curriculum is really jam-packed already, and that consent isn't an entire priority, and that we're taking up too much airtime. But I think we need more airtime.
Definitely. The next question is from Brody Paparella, who asks, have you had many reflections from gender diverse people and people identifying as diverse sexualities, and how have these sat alongside the other testimonies and contributions?
For sure. So the types of conversations I've had in terms of like from a testimony perspective has been that has stood out to me have usually been from gay men who had not come out to their friends and family when they were at school, and they have just told me, and this is over like a handful, maybe like 5 to 8 conversations with different men, about how they've just been left especially vulnerable to sexual assault, because they didn't have any sex ed, because our sex ed, the minimal that we do get, is all about heterosexual relationships. And they talk about the fact that because there's a taboo around their sexuality in their childhood, they usually go to the internet, or like older men usually prey on them and things like that as a way to explore their sexuality for the first times. And this leaves them very vulnerable to grooming, to sexual assault and things like that. And it's quite heartbreaking to hear it from that perspective. I also have a few of my closest friends non-binary, but were socialized as girls and experienced life as girls. And it's really interesting to see. Like one of my best friends, Carla, the non-binary, they were sexually assaulted when they were young, we went to school together, like subject to all the same things that we were on a day-to-day basis. And then the other day I was talking about how I get scared walking through London alone, and they were like, well, I don't get scared ever. And I'm like, it's because you kind of look like a boy. Like, nice. that'll keep you safe. So I think that it's while this affects all different sexualities and gender diverse people, the common thread does tend to be people who are perceived by society as girls and women are most adversely affected in that moment, and people whose sexual partners are men seem to be most affected by sexual assault.
The next question is from Jasmine Wu. She says, how would you suggest navigating a conversation about consent and rape culture with a friend or family member who's reluctant to acknowledge the severity and the legitimacy of the issue?
God, that's a hard one. Like, there needs to be a trade-off, because obviously everyone needs to take it upon themselves to try educate you know, friends and family and things like that, but you also need to care for your own mental health, and sometimes it can be exhausting, and you get to a point where you can't, especially if you're a victim yourself, you're re-triggering yourself when you try to engage in these conversations. But I mean, I think just starting with like little things and avoiding buzzwords. I love buzzwords. I love toxic masculinity. I love rape culture. I love saying it. I love slut shaming. But, you know, when you're having conversations with people who may be turned off by those sort of things, you know, just saying like, oh, our attitudes towards gender, like, oh, it's really weird that this seems to happen to girls more than boys, you know, just kind of like getting it in there slowly, so that when you do have these larger conversations, it makes sense. And then as hard as it is, to kind of I guess try like stay calm in that conversation. But again, I'm completely acknowledging that being able to stay calm through a conversation about sexual assault is a level of privilege that most victims and survivors don't have. But yeah, I mean, it's hard because the whole thing about this is we're not just educating students, we're basically like tipping Australia upside down and being like, actually, everything that you've been teaching through our society so far has led to this, so we can't do that anymore. And it's really hard for a lot of people, especially older generations who aren't really used to having their beliefs and challenged.
The next question is from Bronwyn Curry. She says, in March of this year, we had the Australia-wide Women's March for Justice. I was an organiser for the Melbourne rally where 20,000 women and allies came out. Congratulations and thank you, Bronwyn. Speaking with friends afterwards, I was surprised at the number of male partners of friends who said they felt targeted or even attacked by these events. That's quite telling. What do you think is the most achievable way for men to come on board in supporting women and young girls to achieve true equality in our society? Just a small question for you there, Chanel.
About that one for a second. So first of all, thank you so much for organising that March for Justice. That was amazing historic moment in Australia. Look, there's two things we need to do. We need to one, make men and boys comfortable and engage in this conversation, because unfortunately the structural conditions of our society make it so that they are those in positions of power and they are those who have the most ability to create change, all the way up from politicians to the cool boys at school. But the other thing we need to do is we can't beat around the bush that much. Like, you know, we also need men to be willing. Like, it's uncomfortable. It is really uncomfortable to hold yourself accountable. It is really uncomfortable to realize that all those times your friend made rape jokes when you were 15 led to the situation where your friend got raped when she was 16. But I know it's also really uncomfortable being sexually assaulted and sexually harassed in our everyday lives. And, you know, there's different types of challenges that we're facing right now to get over this. So I think that including men in the conversation is absolutely essential. And we need to do it in a way so that, again, like, my fundamental belief is all about, like, from this very moment on, from when you learn a new piece of information, how you deal with that in future, that's what's absolutely fundamental, because our current justice system, like, does not hold accountability for perpetrators of these actions. And, you know, things as little as a car beep, like a car honk or a sexual harassment, things like that. There's not many people in our society who haven't done that at some stage. But yeah, I think it's being able to kind of like swallow your own pride for a second and sit with that discomfort, and then go forward with that to be better. And also just kind of taking upon yourself, like, kind of give men leadership roles in the sense of being like, okay, you agree this is bad, and think about how much good you can do if you use your influence as a man in your society, in your friend group, to go and change that. But yeah, it's this really hard line that's hard to toe between keeping men like in this conversation without leading it, because obviously still does need to be led by survivors.
The next question is from Shanae Manane, and she says, how willing do you think the federal government is to take serious action, particularly mandating consent education in private and religious schools?
I think they're on the brink of mandating consent education in Australian schools, in terms of how seriously they're willing to take sexual assault as a concept, and when it actually is affecting them specifically. It's when it's in their party, when it's their friends, when it's the people they've elected into positions of power. Don't know how seriously they're willing to take it there. I mean, I feel like that's true of a lot of people. Everyone's happy to stand up against rape culture until it's their best friend being accused, or their friend coming forward as a victim. But I think that, as I said, it's pretty hard to argue with teaching consent, because it's pretty hard to argue with the fact that there's something wrong with child sexual assault.
Absolutely. There's a couple of questions here around how can we get to read about some of the actual content and methodology of some of the new consent education things that are coming through. Do you want to just give us again, Teach Us Consent? Are there any other resources that you would recommend for people?
So I'll let you know what's happening in government at the moment. So do you all remember that like milkshake debacle when they tried to the government tried to promote consent education and ended up like with this metaphorical video of someone shoving a milkshake in someone's face, people who don't know. And basically since then, they had this website called the Good Society, and the government has assembled a panel which is conducting a review on the material on that website to see what could be like problematic or harmful or counterproductive to teach our teens. But I mean, there are lots of great TED Talks of consent. There are lots of great books, especially for like parents, how to teach young children, how to socialize young children in a way that this is kind of fundamental to them. And unfortunately, like in Australia, what you can do is you can have someone come in and give a consent talk at your school. You can like pay quite a lot of money to have a really comprehensive consent talk experience, whether that be to students, teachers, parents, or organizations, things like that. But yeah, it's not just like there's a go-to website, and I think that's something lacking in the market. But I'm hoping to add more and more resources to teachusconsent.com as I have time.
Yeah. And I will also point out the Me Too movement has a lot of resources that you can look up as well in terms of support, particularly for survivors of sexual assault and things like that. So there's plenty available online. And I will just mention that if this conversation has raised any issues for you, you can call Lifeline on 131114. That's crisis support and suicide prevention. And there's lots of other available support services available as well. But we hope that this conversation hasn't been too triggering for people. We really appreciate, we've had hundreds of you online with us today, up above 500 for this conversation. So obviously an incredible conversation and an important one to be having. And thanks so much for coming along today. Chanel, is there anything else that you want to add? We've got a couple of minutes to go and then we'll wind up.
I just want to thank everyone so much for being part of this conversation. Whatever your views are on it, keeping in dialogue is absolutely essential to everything. Being open to critical reflection, and looking towards the future is just I think the momentum is still going, and I hope everyone can keep it going.
Yeah, well, you've managed to have a huge impact in a very short space of time. So congratulations and thank you for all your activism. I'm sure it's made a huge difference for a lot of people and will for many years to come. Hugely important work. And thank you again so much for joining us today, particularly with your master's due so close. We do appreciate your time, which is obviously very precious at the moment.
To speak with you, Ebony. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate that so many of you came along, particularly because we're at a bit of a different time as well. Thanks for all your amazing questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but there were some really great ones in there, and I hope we tackled a good variety of them. We will have to wrap it up there. Thanks again to Chanel Contos. Hello again to her mum and dad who are watching. And don't forget to subscribe to australiainstitute.tv. You can find all the recordings from our previous webinars, and this one will be up in the next day or so on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe there. And also to our podcast, Follow the Money, which you can find on wherever you normally listen to podcasts, you can find and subscribe to it there. And Thanks so much for coming along today. Stay safe out there, everyone, particularly as the pandemic seems to be getting worse here in Australia. Get vaccinated when and if you can, as soon as possible. I'm booked in here in the blessed People's Republic of the ACT for September for my Pfizer vaccine. So I know it's difficult to find them, but we are encouraging everyone to get vaccinated when they can. Stay safe out there, everyone. We hope to see you next week. And thanks again to you, Chanel. Bye.
Thank you so much, Ebony.